Our last system that we are going to be covering in Anatomy 1 is the nervous system. So we'll start with just a look at the functions of this particular system. It's going to respond to both internal and external stimuli, so things going on inside and outside of your body. It will transmit nerve impulses both to and away from the central nervous system, so it means to and away from your brain or your spinal cord. They'll interpret nerve impulses at the cerebral cortex, assimilate or put together experiences in memory and learning, initiate glandular secretions and muscle contractions. An example of glandular secretions would be like your certain glands releasing hormones. And it's also going to be responsible for programming instinctual behavior. So kind of like some built-in behaviors would fall into that, reactions to things. All right, so here if we look at how we would divide the nervous system, okay, we divide it into both the central nervous system, or CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then the other division would be the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, and that includes all of the nerves. The PNS can also be further subdivided into the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. The autonomic nervous system would be involuntary functions, and somatic would be voluntary. So an example would be for your autonomic nervous system, your breathing rate. Okay, your diaphragm, that muscle contracts and relaxes to allow you to breathe. And that control is involuntary. It's controlled by our autonomic nervous system. For voluntary things like you typing to fill out your notes on your keyboard, that would be voluntary. So that's controlled by the somatic nervous system. If we look at the cells of the nervous system, that's going to include neurons. And our neurons have three parts to them, three main parts. We have the cell body of the neuron, which is the main part of the neuron. It's this part right here, this kind of central part. It has nucleus, mitochondria, and other organelles. What's going to bring information to the cell body is going to be dendrites. Okay, so those are going to gather information from neighboring neurons to bring that information to the cell body so that the cell body can kind of decide what needs to happen. And then we have the axon, this long projection here from the cell body that carries signals away from the cell body, the neuron, and it can pass that message on to the next neuron kind of in the chain where the signal would need to be sent. So we take a look, a little bit different diagram. Okay, we would have again the cell body here with a nucleus. Dendrites bring information in from neighboring neurons. The cell body decides what needs to happen and then sends signals down the axon. So the axon runs down the middle of this structure here, and it's covered by what we call Schwann cells, which have a myelin sheath. It's kind of like an insulation. So it protects and allows the signal to be sent smoothly along the axon until it's reaching the axon terminals. Let me get rid of that box here. Until it's reaching the axon terminal, so the signal can then be sent to any other surrounding neurons. These little spaces here are called nodes of Ranvier. There's no myelination there, so that would be uncovered. If you think of the myelin as kind of like the insulation on a wire for something, so if you were to plug your cell phone charger into an outlet, the brick part of your phone charger would be like the cell body, the main part that's gathering information. The dendrites would be like the prongs that go into the outlet. They're going to pick up information or pick up the electricity from the outlet and pass that to the cell body or the brick of your phone charger. And then that cell body decides what needs to happen and sends a signal through the axon, which is covered by myelin. Whereas in your phone charger, it's going to keep sending the electrical signal through the wires that are covered by, depending on what kind of charger you have, like the white plastic rubbery kind of coating or black maybe. So that myelin is there to allow those signals to be sent smoothly. If you've ever had that plastic coating on a charger break, you know that kind of impedes or impairs the way the charger works. So if something happens to this myelin on a neuron, neurons, that also means that the signals won't be sent properly. The way we classify neurons is based on their function or the direction that they send their impulses, and we can fit them into one of three categories for the most part. We have sensory neurons, or they're also called afferent neurons, motor neurons, which are also called efferent neurons, or interneurons. We also call interneurons connecting neurons. So with sensory neurons or afferent neurons, that's going to conduct or send impulses to the spinal cord or brain away from a stimulus of some kind. Your motor neurons send signals away from the brain and the spinal cord to your muscles and glands to cause an effect or allow an effect to happen. Again, we also call them the efferent neurons. Interneurons are going to connect and send signals from sensory neurons to the motor neurons. So an example would be if you put your hand on a hot stove. Your reaction pretty much, if, let's say you were cooking something, you turned the burner off, you forgot it was hot, and you hit it with your hand. Well, if you put your hand down, your immediate reaction is going to be to pull it away, hopefully before you would actually get burned. But what happens is the neurons and nerves that are in your hand, in the skin of your hand, would carry signals away from that impulse. That impulse or that signal would be the hot temperature on the object you're touching. So those signals are carried away from that to the, in this case, your spinal cord, because it's going to happen more quickly. The spinal cord or brain will process the information of what needs to happen. In this case, hey, ding dong, pull your hand off the hot stove so you don't get burned. And it's going to have your motor neurons send the signal and allow you to actually move so you can pull your hand away from the hot object in this case. Okay. So looking still a little more at nerves, if we have a bundle of peripheral axons, that is considered what a nerve would be. It's all the long part of different neurons bundled together. A nerve tract would be a bundle of central axons. And then we can have white matter or gray matter in the brain or the spinal cord. If we look at, this is an actual image of a brain, okay? A picture of a real brain is what I should say, because obviously it's a picture of a brain. You have both white matter, you can see that here, and gray matter, which is this darker part. The difference there is whether the axons are covered with myelin or not. So the white matter would be covered with myelin, so it would look like this, and the gray matter would not be covered with myelin, so those neurons would look like that. So next we're going to take a look at reflex arcs, which shows us how our reflexes work. So our nerve impulses have to be conducted or sent from receptors, so in the case of touching something hot, that would be in your skin, to effectors over neuron pathways, or what we call reflex arcs. There's conduction by a reflex arc that's going to result in some kind of reflex. So in our example we've been using, the reflex would be you pulling your hand away from the hot object. The simplest reflex arcs are just two neuron arcs, meaning that there's going to be a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. In a little more complex reflex arc, you would have three neuron arcs, where you would have sensory neurons synapsing in the spinal cord with interneurons that then synapse with motor neurons. So you have that kind of middle, like, relay point of the interneurons. So it just adds a little more complexity to how things work. All right, my slide's not changing. There we go. So we're going to watch this brief video that kind of explains this in a little more detail.
Reflex action and reflex arc. Whenever we happen to come close to an object that is capable of harming us, we immediately withdraw the part of the body that is the most vulnerable. This is called reflex action. When a person touches a hot cup, the sensory receptors in the hand send a stimulus via the afferent pathway, which contains afferent neurons, to the spinal cord. The afferent neurons enter the dorsal nerve root of the spinal cord. The stimulus is passed on to the efferent neuron, which travels the efferent pathway to reach the effector organ, in this case, the muscles of the arm. As a result, the hand is quickly pulled back. The brain is not involved in the reflex actions, as it would take more time for the impulses to travel to and fro from the brain. The afferent neurons or receptors, taking the causal stimulus to the CNS, the spinal cord, the efferent neurons or effectors, the exciter neurons, and the action performed in response to the stimulus together form the reflex arc.
Okay, so hopefully that made it a little easier for you to kind of see what I've been talking about. Here we have just another example of like having your reflexes tested at the doctor's office. Typically would be where they would do this, where they would take a hammer and hit your patellar tendon. That is going to be connected to a nerve, which sends signal along the afferent pathway to your spinal cord, and then through the efferent pathway sends, or the motor pathway, motor neuron, sends a signal back for you to kick your foot out. Okay, so that's just another example. And then if we look at how nerve impulses are sent, so like how this information could go to your spinal cord and then back to cause reaction. If we take a look here, the way that nerve impulses get sent is through changes in the electrical charges of the membranes of the neuron. So we call this an action potential when there's a change in electrical charge. So what's going to happen is, let me go through it here real quick, and then we'll go through it with a diagram. So I'm actually going to, you can pause the video here to get these notes, and I'm actually going to explain this using the diagram on the next slide. So if you're using this video to complete your notes, please pause here so you can complete this slide and then just follow along with my explanation on the next slide. So outside of the membrane of the neuron, so this would be like showing moving along the axon so that the signal can actually be sent along the length of the axon. There are positively charged sodium ions. That's what that Na+ was that you were filling out on the previous slide. Outside of the membrane, the plasma membrane of that axon. And because there's more sodium outside than inside, so that causes the outside to have a positive charge, the inside to have a negative charge. So when there is a signal, a stimulus, that's going to cause the sodium channels to open, and those sodium ions are going to move into the axon. So those positive charges are going inside, which means now there's more positive charge inside than outside. So the inside becomes positive and the outside becomes negatively charged. That gets sent a little further down. The sodium channels continue to open. Sodium goes in, changes the charge on the inside to positive, the outside becomes negative. And we can see behind that, where the signal just came from, the sodium moves back out of the neuron. So the outside returns to being positive and the inside returns to being negative. That happens until you get to the very end of the axon. So you can think of it like if you are standing in a line shoulder to shoulder with a group of people, and you're passing something along. Let's say you just have a football or let's say a basketball in your hand. So at the beginning, you don't have a basketball, and then somebody passes it to you, so you do have the basketball, and then you pass it to the person next to you. So that moves along, and you go back to not having the basketball in your hands. That is like you having this change in charges as the signal gets passed. Sodium goes in, so the outside becomes negative. It moves down a little bit more. The sodium moves back out. The next, sodium channels open, sodium goes in. And again, that would happen like a relay kind of thing all the way along the length of this axon. And that's going to allow those signals to be sent. When you get your signal to the end of the neuron, it's going to reach what we call the synapse. And the synapse is going to be the place, it's a location kind of where impulses are transmitted or sent from one neuron to another. You would have a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron is the one sending the signal, and the postsynaptic neuron would be the one receiving the signal. So to do that, you're going to have chemicals called neurotransmitters that allow that nerve impulse to kind of travel to the next neuron. So our neurons don't actually touch each other, and we'll look at them here. So your neurons, again, this would be the presynaptic neuron, and here would be the postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron has chemicals inside of it, these little purple circles, and those are chemicals we call neurotransmitters that are capable of sending signals. It could be to the very next neighboring neuron. It could be elsewhere in the brain, for example. But this neuron the presynaptic neuron is going to package up those neurotransmitters in nice little neat packages called vesicles. Those vesicles move and they merge with the membrane of the presynaptic neuron. And then those neurotransmitters are released into this space right here. So this space we have here is part of the synapse. It's called the synaptic cleft. So again, you can see that our neurons don't actually touch. There is a little bit of space there. And those neurotransmitters released by the presynaptic neuron are going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft and activate these receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And that allows changes to occur in the postsynaptic neuron. If we look at some examples of neurotransmitters, okay, you just have to fill in the names of some of them. These are just some neurotransmitters, but first we have acetylcholine. That helps with muscle contraction and stimulating certain hormones to be released. In our central nervous system, it's involved with wakefulness, attentiveness, anger, and aggression. It seems to have some role in Alzheimer's. And with the diseases that are listed here, we'll be going over some of them in a class later this week. Next, we have dopamine. Dopamine is kind of like the feel-good hormone. So when you're doing something that's enjoyable, your brain releases dopamine. And then that kind of makes you feel happy. So it's also going to control your movement and posture, regulate your mood, and plays a role in positive reinforcement and dependency. So it also has a role in people becoming addicted to like drugs, for example. Chemicals in the drugs people take cause their brain to release dopamine, and then their brain gets used to a higher amount of dopamine than normal. So they have to keep using that drug to keep that level of dopamine. And then eventually they need to increase or change whatever drugs they're taking because they need, more and more dopamine to actually feel happy, where if they weren't taking drugs, their brain just does that naturally. So it kind of interferes with the natural release of dopamine. That does seem to be related to Parkinson's disease. Next, we have GABA. So you do already on your notes have gamma aminobutyric acid, but make sure you fill in GABA there because that part is missing for you. That helps with motor control, vision, and other cortical functions in your cerebrum. It also helps to regulate anxiety. So there are drugs that can cause the brain to increase GABA release, and that's used to treat epilepsy, which is a seizure disorder, and Huntington's disease. Next is glutamate, which has a role in learning and memory, and it's thought to be associated with Alzheimer's because there's like memory issues with Alzheimer's. Norepinephrine is going to be released in any kind of like stressful situation. So it's going to cause your heart rate to increase, breathing rate to increase, things like that. It seems to be involved with mood disorders like manic depression. And then we have serotonin, which helps to control our body temperature, our sleep patterns, mood, appetite, and pain. Seems to be related, like abnormal levels of serotonin seem to be related to depression, impulsive behavior, and aggressiveness. So when we have the disorders involving those particular neurotransmitters or chemicals that our brain produces, that is related to having like not the correct amount of those being produced is how it would cause a disorder. So next we're going to look specifically at the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The brain has 3 divisions, so the brainstem, cerebellum, and cerebrum. And then we would also have the spinal cord. So here we can see the cerebrum, it's the majority of our brain. Then we have the cerebellum, and then the brainstem, and then the spinal cord would be down here. So if we take a look at the brainstem, it consists of 3 parts, and they are named here in ascending order. So meaning from down here, which would be the medulla oblongata, then we have the pons, and then the midbrain is above that. They go in that order. The structure is going to be mostly white matter, meaning it's myelinated, it has that insulation. And it's going to have little bits of gray matter scattered throughout. Lots of important reflex centers are actually in our brainstem. So looking a little more specifically at that, we would have your medulla oblongata, which would be right here, just atop of the spinal cord. So it helps to connect the rest of the brain to the spinal cord. It's going to regulate our breathing, heart and blood vessel function, digestion, sneezing, and swallowing. So very kind of basic primitive functions that we need in order to stay alive. The way brains evolved in animals, and yes, humans are animals, was the brain stem is the first part of the brain to evolve, then the cerebellum, and then the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is responsible for more of like our higher level thinking and things like that. So we have the medulla oblongata. Above that, we have the pons, and that's going to help to send messages from the cortex of the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So it kind of allows for communication back and forth. And then the midbrain is just a little bit higher up. That's going to be associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wake cycles, alertness, as well as temperature regulation. Next, if we look at the cerebellum, it's the second largest part of our brain, so you can see it highlighted in red here. It's going to help to control muscle contractions so that our movements are coordinated. With that, it means that we're going to have be able to maintain our balance, move smoothly and not kind of all like jerky and not coordinated. And it's also going to help us to maintain our normal posture. We still don't know a lot about the brain, but recent evidence and research shows that the cerebellum is maybe more involved with coordinating different effects in our brain and helping the cerebrum and other regions of the brain more than we previously thought. Okay, so this is the first part of our lesson. If you're watching this, it was because you missed class on our first day covering the nervous system. So you'll need to make sure the first part of your notes are filled out, but you should not submit them yet until we are finished the notes completely.